Hey everybody, so this is going to be the introduction to Thea, Thea for Rhino that is. I'm going to cover the sort of basic setup for general rendering, a couple different types of basic materials, and the general things you'll need to do in order to create a rendering for this assignment. So this demo does assume you already have Thea installed. You should have the Thea render panel, which are these blue guys up here, as well as the Thea, or these are the Thea toolbar. The Thea render panel is actually this here. If you don't have either, but you have installed, you can right click anywhere to go, or right click in the toolbar to add toolbars. You could go down to where Thea is, make sure it's checked. On the render panels on the right, you can do the same thing in the empty space and just make sure that the Thea render panel is indeed applied. You will also want to make sure that current render is set to Thea for Rhino. As you can see, I have both Thea and V-Ray installed. In general, it's usually not a good idea to install more than one renderer. These seem to be working okay together, but I have had issues with crashing and things in the past with others. However, so far for me, it's been working okay to have both, but probably a good idea to just limit yourself to one at a time. So I have imported the Barcelona Pavilion model into the studio site model. So for you'll want to use either the public restroom precedent model that we constructed in assignment 5 in skills, or your studio model that you designed in studio for public restroom. In either case, I want you to bring them to this specific site so that we can use the buildings that are so nicely drawn up and detailed as part of your context. Whenever doing renderings, whether it's interiors or exteriors, being able to understand the space that you're in is, of course, super important. So in this case, since we're looking at a building on a existing site with an existing context around it, having that level of detail will be very helpful in order to really understand the scale of this intervention that we have and its sort of place on the site. Another thing, the site model, or the site base, I should say, that I have here is based on the topography. So it isn't a completely flat surface, which is definitely something I would encourage, especially if you end up doing a section perspective, which I'll cover both how to do a section perspective as well as a standard perspective. But it makes a big difference for any site, but in this one, because there is about an 8-foot drop off from the highest point to lowest point, when cutting through a section perspective, you really get to see the impact of that. So definitely encourage to use the highest level of detail for your site as possible, and basing that on the actual topography is a great idea there. I did do a demo for this that was posted, I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago at this point, on how to go through that process and make a really detailed, nice site model like you see here. Another thing you'll want to do is the buildings here, I've all pulled down to locate them on the site model, so that you can see here, it's actually sitting slightly below. That might be a little bit more than necessary in this case. But in general, you want to make sure your buildings are making contact with the ground so that you don't end up with some weird shadows beneath a floating building. Another thing, at least for Thea, now this may be different for V-Ray, I haven't tested it fully yet, but Thea did not play particularly well with work sessions in models. It just didn't render them. And when I had models that were inserted, it worked okay, but there were some glitches. So I found it easiest to just directly import all the models, the context models, into a single site model. So in this case, all these models are live and they live in this, as well as all of their sort of curved geometry that's here. They're still ordered by layers, of course, as you normally would do, but I did find that the linked things just had some issues. And again, the inserted worked better than work session. Work session didn't work at all for Thea. Okay, so first thing you'll probably want to do is figure out what view you want to take of your model. So in general, all of your views for this assignment should be done at eye level. Now this is approximately eye level, but we want to get something that's actually a measured eye level. Now the same goes for whether you're doing a section perspective or a standard perspective. To set up a section perspective, you really just need to have a clipping plane. So I'm just going to create a vertical clipping plane and just make sure it's aligned to the model so we don't have an off axis. And the nice thing about Thea is this will just automatically render. So as long as it's active in the view that you are rendering, it will render at the time you do your rendering. This is a really nice thing. It's not something that all programs do. And in the past, back my day when I was in school, you actually physically had to cut the model and delete half of the model in order to create a section. It didn't handle live clipping planes like this at all. But essentially, you'll want to set up a view. I always find it easiest to enable the camera so that we can really set the height of this view. So in this case, just go to Camera and Show Camera. You can also hit F6 on a keyboard if you have F keys. And that will make your camera, whichever one you have active, a physical object in your other views that you can adjust. So it's a little chaotic here, but basically we can pull this down to a known height. So I'm just going to select that single point, and I'm going to snap it to something. It doesn't matter. I just want to snap it to what I know is the ground level. So I'm going to snap it right here. And that didn't quite work. Let's try that again. It's close. Sometimes the snapping is a little weird with these. But let's see if we can find something else to snap to. Oh, I was wrong point. That was why. Okay. So the view should look incorrect right now because we are essentially a worm's eye view literally at the ground. We want to, and again, I'm using elevation here. And see, you can barely see that right now. I'm going to move my little face for a second. Actually, I'll just move the view. So my elevation view is in wireframe, so there's just so much information. Oftentimes it's easier if you don't use wireframe, use something like shaded, and make sure that your clipping plane is affecting that same view. I'm just going to make sure it affects everything. That way I can see just what it is seeing. And it looks like I moved my camera again in this process. Try the right view and see how that looks. I want to just be able to, this will be much easier. I want to be able to snap to something that I can see. So I'm going to click the point and snap to I think I'm still not snapping correctly. Again, it's a little finicky, but just play with it until you get it to snap to what you want it to. And then we can raise the camera. We'll do 5.5 feet. And it is looking down right now, as you can see. So I'm actually not going to worry about that because I'll just set this to a 2-point perspective, which in 2-point perspective, you can't actually look down or up. You can only look, well, I guess you can look down. What am I saying? Although looking down or up does tend to add a lot of distortion. You know, I have really just made this whole camera thing really disorderly right now. I'm going to go back and just try to get this approximately lined up and then try to do the snaps one more time and see if I can do a better job. Snap to something. The elevation view really is the best way to do this. In fact, I'm not even going to snap. I'm just going to get really close. So I just want it to be at the ground level. Okay, close enough. Because then I'm just going to go up 5'5", which is the sort of standard height to use. Okay, so that was much harder than it needed to be. Now, in order to, if I start zooming around, I could end up changing the height of my camera. So I'm going to try to make my adjustments as to where I take the cut. Just using the show camera tool and moving the points of my model of my camera around. So now there are other ways you can do this. You can actually set the height of the camera, but because my surface here isn't exactly at 0, I would have to go and measure that, and it's kind of equally as much work to do that. Okay, so I'm getting close now. Then I fell. This just isn't my day. But anyways, the goal will be to get something kind of like this set up. Ideally, try to get it to be a realistic height because it will make the post-processing process of adding in people significantly easier because you can align everyone's eyes that is standing on the same surface. So anyways, let's just say that I was, after playing with this, and was able to get a view that I liked. And actually, I think I'm going to not use a section cut for this demo, although you can. Again, it's totally up to you. But let's say I wanted to do, how about a view standing on the edge here? And again, just I'm going to try this one more time, even though it's been tremendously unsuccessful. So now I did it right. You can see it is snapped. My eye level is directly on the ground, which is too low. So if we go 5.5 up, I now have a view. I'm going to right click on the orbit tool here, which allows me to sort of look left and look right without changing the height of the camera. And I think that's going to be about it. And then I might do a little bit of a, no, I don't want to pan because that'll change my height. So I'm just going to leave it here. This is good. Whenever doing renderings, it is crucially important to save the view because you are inevitably going to shift around, which just won't help you. So under named views, which you can type in named views in the command line and bring up this tab. I have the tab open just on the right side since I am doing renderings. It'll be helpful. Save to you. And of course, so now if I shift, I can always double click on it and it'll take me right back there. So you can see what would happen if I panned, which wouldn't have been very helpful. Okay, so that took longer than necessary, but it's a good thing to get that set up. So the Thea render panel, which should be this guy here, has several things that we're going to sort of pay attention to. The first panel here doesn't have much that you really need to pay too close attention to, at least in your sort of initial setup process. We could turn on what's called clay rendering, which basically just overrides materials so that they're in their simplest form and just takes less time to process, which is a great way to test lighting conditions. You wouldn't necessarily want to do a final render with this enabled. However, it's pretty useful in general when just testing lighting. It won't override glass, which is a nice feature, so that you can still get light into interior spaces. Other things that are sort of notable that you might want to pay attention to, there was an ambient occlusion function here, although I'll go over that potentially in an advanced rendering video that will be separate, because the way you use that in this in Thea is a little bit odd. Down here at the bottom, you do have devices. So currently, it's set to use the interactive mode and the Presto engine. So Thea has multiple different engines. So in interactive, you can only use Presto and adaptive AMC. I would recommend Presto. Essentially, the difference is Presto is a sort of fast version that simulates a unbiased renderer pretty closely. AMC is going to be their biased version. And I tend to prefer the unbiased effect because I think it's one of the benefits of Thea is the simplicity of the unbiased renderer. Now, when you go to production mode, and this is what you do for your final rendering, you do get a few more options. So you do have unbiased TR1, unbiased TR2, adaptive BSD, and adaptive AMC. So these up here are going to be your bias options. Your unbiased options are called the unbiased options, and then Presto, of course, still exists. For this assignment and for general use, I'm just going to recommend Presto for everything. It seems to work really well. It's pretty fast, and the quality difference I don't think is going to be really noticeable until you get into really sort of high-end, fancy rendering where you're really paying a lot of attention to light, caustics, the way light moves through objects, all the sort of really intense behaviors of light that we might be more concerned with. In which case, so TR1 is designed for exterior renderings and TR2 is designed for interior renderings. They are both going to be a bit slower. So again, from my experience, just leave everything at Presto and switch between interactive and production for when you're actually ready to output something. At the bottom, you do have your devices. So Presto can run both on GPUs and on CPUs. For my computer, it is faster for it to run on the GPU, although it actually could run on both at the same time and get a little bit of a speed boost that way. For your laptop, it might be worthwhile to try one or the other and see which one is faster for you. It just depends heavily on the hardware that you have. So again, it just depends. For me, this is a bit of a faster way to have it set up. So next we have environment. So this is kind of exactly what it sounds like, environment that's affecting everything. So Thea by default is going to be using the V-Ray Sun Sky system, which we can make adjustments to. So these first settings here are basically going to be the characteristics of the air that the sun is moving through. So if we want to add in more ozone or water vapor or any of these other things, it will affect the way the sun is illuminating the scene, just like the atmosphere affects the sun in real life. I tend to not mess with these as I don't fully understand the difference in turbidity and ozone and water vapor and really how it's going to affect my output. So in general, I just kind of leave these at their defaults. Next, we have the sun. Again, I'm going to leave the color at its default. Now there is a soft shadows option, which basically instead of having super crisp hard line shadows, you can allow it to have softer shadows. Just enable this or disable it if you please. Either way is fine. It's kind of a personal preference. The multiplier here, I currently have set to 5. I found that to be a nice sort of compromise on softness. The higher the value, the softer the shadows. The lower the value, the less the effect. Uniform illumination. So this is useful if you don't want to deal with the sun and just want to have everything uniformly illuminated. So that might be more for if you were doing a render diagram of some sort, where you're not really concerned as much about direct sun, but really just want to illuminate your scene. And it can be set to any color with any intensity. If you were using this, I might suggest turning the sun off so that you don't end up having two different light sources. So if you type in lights, it'll bring up the lights in your model. And again, you can turn these on and off just here. If you're using the uniform illumination, I'd recommend turning the sun off and the skylight off so that you only have that informing the scene and vice versa. Whether you use the skylight or not is kind of optional. Essentially, the sun by itself is really just going to be focused more on direct light. Adding in the skylight will add in some indirect light, as well as provide a sort of simulated sky for reflections to actually reflect. So a good example is we have a pool of water right here. With the skylight turned off, there is no sky, so it just reflects blackness, which isn't super realistic. But with the skylight turned on, it starts to reflect the sort of simulated sky tones that are there. So that tends to work better in general if you're using the Rhino Sun to leave that on. Now there are some other options here that I'm going to go over in an advanced video. So image-based lighting. This is where instead of using the sky system, you use what's called an HDRI, which is a very high resolution, high information spherical image of the sky that uses the actual real-world skies to illuminate your scene. This is, in my opinion, sort of the best way of doing really nice, beautiful renderings with some caveats. One, you don't necessarily get to choose the time of day. So although you can rotate that spherical image, the sun really is in one particular location in that spherical image, and it should be the same in your model. So you have a little bit less control over that. But because it's based on real skies, you get really nice, rich lighting effects from the ambient light of the sky. You know, some of these you might be able to simulate, again, with the sun settings and adjusting turbidity and ozone. It's not something that I'm suggesting you do for this assignment because, again, not being able to set particular times of day is a little less useful because sometimes your design, may be really important to see it one time versus another, and you want that flexibility. So using the sun sky system, I think, is going to be your best bet. If you were doing something like a nighttime rendering, image-based lighting is really great to use because you'll get not only the sort of moon and the sun and the moon and the stars, but also just sort of an ambient light of the sky. And again, I'll go over that later time. So you can do something similar if you just want to have a background image. So just to throw a sky into your scene, a spherical image of a sky could be added here. Not something that I think is super necessary because we can replicate that pretty easily in Photoshop, but it is an option. So next, what is probably the most important and most useful of the panels, in my opinion at least, is the camera. So Thea, like V-Ray and a lot of other rendering softwares, use similar settings to what you might have on a DSLR physical camera in the real world. So if you have experience using a DSLR, that will actually come in handy here. So if you took a photography class in school or something like that. The first settings that are going to be really important is sync Rhino viewport. Essentially, that's just going to make sure the output resolution matches the screen that you're looking at right now. After that, make sure lock aspect ratio is set, and then you can adjust the resolution to be higher. That way, whatever you're rendering is going to match the viewport, which is going to be really useful for composing later on. So I'm recommending a final resolution of 3400 by whatever the height is, and that'll be determined by your Rhino viewport. So the second value here will be automatically filled in. Now this is for a final rendering. This is not something you should do for a test rendering because the higher these pixel counts, the slower this process is going to be. For testing, I recommend just setting the width to 1000 and letting the height be whatever. It's not going to be a very pretty image because it's not nearly as many pixels, but will run significantly faster. And when you're just trying to figure out settings and adjustments, it is a much better idea to run a lower resolution. So next, we have some lens things, most of which we don't need to pay too much attention to right now. There is depth of field. So by default, it should be set to pinhole. And this essentially means we have no depth of field. Depth of field is that blur that you get when you take an image with a camera. So if you're in focus on one thing, the background might be out of focus, or the foreground in front of that object might be in focus. We can simulate that in this rendering engine, the same as you can in V-Ray. You just want to set this to F number and then a lower F number, such as I think 1.4 might be the lowest. That will give you a lot of depth of field. I guess 1 it allows you to do. Whereas something high like 16 will give you very little, very wide depth of field. But again, we're just going to leave it at pinhole for this. Next is Z clipping. So this will just clip anything from a certain distance away. Don't need it necessarily right now. This might be for if you're rendering a building inside of an entire city or something where you don't want to have the renderer actually process the rest of the city. You're only concerned about one particular view right now. And that's going to mostly cover the things you need to know about this for the time being. So now we're going to go to, let's see here, we'll go open the Thea darkroom. So this is going to be where most of your rendering actually happens and where a lot of your settings are for things like exposure. So when you click this open, you'll have display settings here. So by default, tone mapping should be set to standard. I prefer filmic. Either one works. And essentially what these are is just how it adjusts and handles exposure of your image. To me, filmic is a more realistic way of doing it and gives you a bit more control. Standard, I think I just found to be a little bit flatter in my experience. There's also Reinhardt, which is a rather confusing way to handle things. It doesn't use camera settings. It's just a little bit different. And in general, there are times where it's useful, but I think for most rendering that you're going to be doing, filmic is probably going to be the way to go. Here you can adjust things like ISO and film speed, which again, if you are familiar with using real cameras in real life, you're probably familiar with what these things are. ISO is film sensitivity, and shutter speed is basically how long the exposure takes. Again, this simulates that same thing that a camera does. So the higher the ISO number, the brighter your image. The lower the shutter speed, the brighter the image. So if you were doing an exterior shot like I'm doing here, I found 100 and 400 as they're set right now to work pretty well for this particular image. For interiors, you're going to need more exposure. So either going to a higher ISO number or a lower number on the shutter speed essentially will accomplish the same thing and allow you to expose the image better for that interior shot. Now, like photography, you'll have to balance exposure. So if you're in an interior space and you're taking an image, you're looking at a window, in order to get that interior to be nicely illuminated, the outside might be blown out with being overexposed. It's replicating the same way a camera works, and that's the way a camera would work. So just know that that's something you might have to mess around with to find sort of a good balance. Some other things in here, so white balance, which you can adjust here, it's in values of Kelvin. Essentially, if your image is either too blue or too orange, adjusting the white balance will sort of help fix that. Higher values will pull out more of the blue tones and make it sort of more neutral based on that. Lower values in the sort of 3000s will pull out some of the orange tones and bring it back to neutral. So something you can adjust. Glare, if you want to add glare into the scene, you can. There's an automatic denoising. I'm just going to leave that as whatever it's set as default. Also really important are going to be the channels. So I think in the assignment, I've specifically asked you to create a couple different channels. The ones that I think are going to be really useful are going to be alpha, depth, material ID, and reflections. And I think that should be good. And for the depth, so depth basically is a black and white grayscale image that gives you the depth of the perspective you're looking at from the camera's perspective. So you would want to set the sort of maximum depth, and that's basically how far away do you think the camera can look in the image that you think is important to calculate right now. So for me, I'm just going to approximate, I'd say maybe 120 feet. So I'll just put that in and leave the default min Z at 0. So Z in this case is just basically depth from the camera. It's not actually on the Z axis in the Cartesian model space. Next is render queue, which we're not going to deal with. So if you want to render multiple views, so if you have all of your named views here and you want to render each one of them in sequence, you can set that up through the render queue. Again, I'm not going to cover that right now since we're only going to be looking at rendering one image at a time. Okay, so we could just hit this render button here to start a render. It's currently set to using Presto, which again, I think is going to be the best option for most cases. And it's currently set to interactive, IR, versus production, PR. Which means that we can continue making changes and the render will update as we do so. So I'm just going to hit go, and pretty quickly you can see the type of image that we're looking at. So because it's interactive, if I rotate, you can see the camera is updating. V-Ray has a similar feature here, but this is how you get it set up for Thea. Now you will notice that we don't see any of the line work, and that's normal. Those lines, none of the renderers really take into account, so that's something we'll add in later in Photoshop. Okay, so I'm going to pause this. So we can actually also, I'm going to close this guy now, do the same thing in the viewport itself. And sometimes this is an easy way to handle things. So we could go down and turn on the Thea render viewport, which will just make the viewport now active with using the Thea render to preview things. You may find this may slow your computer down or may not be the best experience. It again depends heavily on the model you're rendering and your hardware and a bunch of other factors. So this does give you a nice preview of things. And it's generally a good idea when making adjustments. So seeing what's it look like if you turn off the skylight and the sun. Now these light bulbs should change color. For whatever reason they didn't just now, but at least the effect did take place. So you can see if we turn off the sun and we just have the skylight, this is the sort of ambient light that it's bringing in. If we turn off both, we should have no light in the scene. And that's actually often a good test with renderers, is to try to turn off all the lights and make sure you don't have any light. Because occasionally there might be some light source you don't realize exists that is contributing to your scene, which may give you a false sense of what the lighting really is like. Okay, so as with normal things in Rhino, you can make adjustments to the sun. So we can still adjust time of day, and you can see the shadows are changing based on that. So we could find that perfect time of day where we get the most compelling shadows on the perfect day of the year. And we could even do sun studies this way, looking at specific days, specific times, all those kind of things. You can see here, if you go into night, the render starts to look a little bit weird. You're getting these sort of like bright light sources. In general, these renderers don't work particularly well if the sun not existing in the sky. Essentially, it starts to think of the sun beneath the earth, and somehow it still adds light to it because we don't really have a full earth plane. So in general, if you're doing night scenes, you may just want to turn off the sun and just use the ambient light because realistically the sun isn't really contributing anymore to your scene. And it doesn't seem to want to turn those off right now. Maybe I can. So there may be a little bit of glitchiness. It doesn't want to turn off my sun or sky right now anymore. It's always the problem with third-party renderers or third-party software in general. There may be slight weirdness. I did find that I had this happen earlier and just closing the program and opening again fixed it. So if that happens to you, that could be a good option. All right, so next thing we're going to do is create materials. So I'm going to, or I will have distributed a set of materials for everyone to use that look like this. And essentially, we have a number of different things here. I'm just going to go to extra large so we can see. These circles in grate are going to be used to make a screen wall of sorts, where this is actually not what it's going to look like, but just defines the openings in that screen wall. We have this interesting looking image here, which is actually just going to be used to define the surface of the water, so the surface of a pool, and give us the depth of it. We have a number of different bricks just shown as line work, which can be an interesting technique in order to add a little bit of definition to a model without necessarily adding in photorealistic looking bricks. So proportionally, these are set up as the Norman style brick, which is a brick that is 1 foot long instead of being 8 inches long. However, functionally, you could take these same textures and just scale them differently, and you would be able to get a standard 8-inch brick. So a standard for counting bricks is 3 rows of brick tall is 8 inches. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Not quite. It would be ideal if there were 9 tall. But you can use that to approximate how high you think this is versus how wide it is. And again, these are Normans currently, which is not a standard brick that you see in Over the Rhine, but it's just a different type of brick. So this would be 3 feet wide right now. If you kept it proportional, you could make it, 2 feet wide, and that would approximate the look of a standard brick because that would be 8, 16, 24 inches. We also have, some just general lines that could represent, say, floor planks of some sort, or something that you might have lines representing in a model. Again, not every material needs to be photorealistic. I have included one, and this is one that I actually created myself. I found some company had their tile online as a sort of individual tile, so I took them in Illustrator and basically made a repeating pattern of those tiles and extracted the lines from it so that I could create a series of images. So renderers, a lot of them, will take in a texture like this and apply it to your model. But in order for them to really accurately display what a tile looks like, they typically want at least 2 other types of image to go with them. So one is often called a bump map. It can also be referred to as a displacement map, and sometimes you'll see a normal map. Functionally, they all kind of do something very similar, which is it provides black and white information about the depth and the surface quality of the texture. So in this case, the black dark lines here show that the texture isn't flat there, that is actually a groove recessed into it. The texture on the tile just gives you a little bit of 3-dimensionality as the surface may not be completely perfectly flat. And then this other image here is what we call a roughness texture. So this basically defines how rough or clean and crisp the reflection is. So values that are white are going to be very rough, meaning any sort of reflected light that comes off it is going to be dispersed instead of being a clean mirror-like reflection, where any values that are darker are tending to be more clean and crisp. Surfaces tend to be consistently, the same material tends to be consistently reflective, but what actually changes on the surface of a material is more the surface quality that defines the sort of smoothness or roughness of that surface. So basically adding these 3 textures together will get you a very realistic looking tile. Now, this is not something you need to do on a regular basis. I'm going to show the process just because it's something if you wanted to get into sort of more photorealistic rendering, which again isn't really encouraged in general for this assignment. However, having some realistic materials can still make for an abstract image that can be really compelling. So I'm going to just pull these aside for now and going to create a material. So you'll want the materials panel. That's just the default Rhino materials panel. If you don't have it, you can right click and just go to materials. I believe you can just type in materials too, and it should bring up that panel. There's currently nothing in this model, so we're going to start adding some things. Create a new material, and you want to navigate down to where it says Thea material. If you're using V-Ray, you could do V-Ray, but right now we're looking at Thea specifically. Ignore everything above it. Those are the default Rhino materials. We're just going to use Thea. So the first thing you're going to want to do is rename this. It is really going to be helpful to rename things, so it's definitely something I highly encourage doing. So I'm just going to call this glass, and then I will click the material editor here. That will bring up this guy, which is basically the advanced material editor that exists in Thea. So we can make more adjustments here. So clicking on the sort of circle here, I can change the material type. So I can make it into a metal-like material, which gives it that sort of metal-like reflection. I could do a glass material. I could do a thin glass and a SSS, which is a subsurface scattering material. This you could think of as like human skin or a candle wax or something like that, where light actually goes into the material itself before sort of being bounced out without being fully transparent like glass. So again, if you've seen a candle where it sort of glows around the edges or is glowing through the candle, that's essentially what subsurface scattering is attempting to recreate. In general, you probably won't need to use subsurface scattering ever, or very often at least. So between thin glass and glass, this entirely depends on how you've modeled your model. If the glass in your model has thickness, you'd want to use the standard glass option. If the glass that you have in your model is a singular plane with no depth to it, or a surface, you'd want to use thin glass. Either way is fine. The thick glass, or just standard glass material, is going to be a little bit more realistic. And if you want to replicate something like a fogged glass, you want to make sure you're using an actual thickness. The roughness here basically is going to determine that fogged quality. So if we get a preview here, if we turn it up higher, we're going to get a more fogged looking glass. And a very low value is going to be a very clean looking glass. We don't really need a bump for this per se, which is essentially the three-dimensional quality of that material, because we're just replicating glass. So for this model, I know that all of my glass is actually thin glass, meaning they are single surfaces. So I'm just going to use the thin glass. And that's all I'm going to do. I can now right-click on the material and do assign to layers and navigate down to my glass layer, which is right there, and just hit OK. I can also do the same thing through the layers panel just by clicking on the material. And then it'll ask me to assign a material, and I can pick the ones that I've already created. There are multiple ways of assigning materials. This is, in my opinion, the best way of doing it is through layers. You can do it per object as well, but it's very difficult to keep organized when doing materials as applied through objects, so it's not something I recommend doing. Okay. So we're going to go and create a few more materials. So next, where do materials go? Right here. Let's create a water material. So for this, I'm going to go to Thea material. We'll just call this water and go back to edit material. Now in this case, I could do a couple different things. So I could use the standard thick glass material and give this a little bit of a bluish hint. Very near white, but just the slightest bit of blue, just to sort of maybe replicate the sort of color of water a little bit. And then simply add in a bump to it. So I'm going to click this little button here. It's going to ask me for a procedural or a bitmap. I'm going to bitmap and click the image that I will have provided you guys, the Numerato pool water displace. And you want to set the percentage to be something low. I'm going to try 5%. And you can see here, it starts to look a little bit like water. So now I can do the same thing and apply to layers and go to my, I think it's water layer. Makes sense. And you can see I'm starting to get some previews. So in my, under display options, I'm currently in a shaded view. You can set the shaded view to use your rendering material. However, glass from V-Ray doesn't actually display as glass, so just know that that won't actually display as transparent, but the rest of your materials will display their proper textures. So just hit OK. So if we were to now sort of test this, so I'm going to go to Thea Render, we can see we have water. That looks pretty realistic, and we have glass. So the scale of this water is something we can adjust. So if we select this object, which we can do while the Thea Render is running, we can go to Properties for that individual object and go to Texture Mapping, that's right here, and go to Box Mapping. There's multiple mapping options here. Box mapping I find to be the most useful. And essentially what it'll ask you to do is draw out a box that defines the sort of scale of the texture. So I'm just going to type in 10, 10, 10. So just even dimensions because it's a square texture, so I want to start with that. And hit OK. And you can see here, it changed the look of my texture. I basically made it smaller. So once I've done that, once I have box mapping applied, I can make adjustments here. So I could say maybe 10, 10, 10 wasn't the right size, and that's 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet, or whatever model units you're working in. So maybe if I did 60 by 60 by 60, you can see here the water is now a much larger texture, so it's much more stretched out. It also looks a little bit calmer. Let's go 150, not 150, 150. And again, stretch it out even further. And you can see it's really subtly waving now. Now, this also contributes to the amount of bump. So if we add in more, you can see it starts to look more dramatic and even more dramatic. Now, it starts to look kind of silly, in my opinion, at some point. So I usually keep the bump value fairly low, just for a subtle effect. And I think I liked the 60 size better. Oops, 60. There it is. So to me, I think that looks pretty good. And I'm pretty happy with that. So that's all I have to do for water. Now, there's another way of doing this, which is, so this button here, the Thea Content Browser, actually has a bunch of presets already. So we could go down to liquids, and let's see, there's SW pool water, and then there's just water. I could drag this in and then drag it on top of the image here, and it will replace that. Now, the water that they have doesn't seem to have any texture applied to it, meaning any sort of bumpiness. So I'm going to just come in and add in that procedural bitmap and turn the value down again. Now theirs might be a little bit more realistic because it seems that we're able to see through the water a little bit more than the one that I had initially made. So this is seemingly better than my initial way of making it. Now we could still add in color if we wanted this to be red water for some reason. Looks like blood water or something. But maybe we just add a teensy bit of color. You can see here even a very small amount, and the tone is really what we're getting right there. Has a big impact. Okay, so that was that. Let's start adding in some more materials. So again, we could go through here and we could add other materials. So if we decided we wanted to use, well, these these are diffuse materials, but cloth materials. So if we want to add leathers, metals, all these sort of standard metals, all you have to do is double click them. So if we wanted to add in, I know the columns are basically a chrome. So let's just double click this. It will appear now in your material palette. So we can apply this to our columns, apply to layers, and crucifix columns. And I also want to apply it to my frames as well. So let's go back, and I believe it is the window frames. Frame. Now, that doesn't look exactly like what I want, so of course I can still make adjustments to it. I wanted a shinier version of this. And we'll turn down the roughness. So if we turn it down to 0, it should be a pretty basically mirror-like reflection. So if we give it just a little bit, maybe a value of 2, you can see we get a sort of fuzzy-looking reflection. Now, we could add in surface imperfections. If you Google the term noise map or dirt map, or those are usually the good go-tos. You might be able to get some textures that just are generally black and white textures that are kind of grungy looking or look like dirt. And those are actually a great way to sort of add a little bit of texture to a material like this and make it appear to not just have a perfectly smooth reflection. Okay, so that's a metal material. So of course there's more things in here. The online repository, these are textures that other people have made. Their quality is going to vary dramatically. I mean, they're made by random people. So my general preference is to not use other people's textures because I don't know how they were made. I don't know their quality. They could end up bringing in some texture maps that are absolutely enormous that then crash my model because they're way too big a file size and designed for something else entirely. So I tend to not like using these very much. The sort of standard ones and the basic materials and through here are all good starting points that you can use. You know, with some transparent things here. So if you want to use a frosted glass or green glass or whatever it may be, these can be great starting points that you can then manipulate further. So car paints, matte materials, water, highly reflective things, emitters. So if you wanted to make like a light bulb and you wanted it to glow, you would use an emitter. In this case, these replicate the different light qualities of an incandescent 100-watt light bulb, a halogen, a fluorescent, et cetera, et cetera. You can see here on the ground that you get slightly different tones. So an incandescent is a warm light. On a Kelvin scale, that's sort of going to be in the 2700 to 3000 Kelvin. A fluorescent light here with this sort of bluer light, that's probably going to be in the higher Kelvin scale, maybe 4000, 5000, 6000. The bluer it gets, typically the higher Kelvin value it is. And that's just a measure that we use for light that basically just measures the color temperature from warm to cool. Okay, so now let's make a texture. So I'm going to go back and go to Thea materials, create a new one, and let's call this tile. Close out this, and tile, I'm going to do the same thing, hit the material editor button. In this case, I'm going to go to diffuse. So you have 4 standard layers that you see here: diffuse, reflectance, roughness, and bump. Diffuse is going to be your color of the material or a texture. Reflectance is how reflective it is from 1 to 0, so or in this case from black to white, which is essentially the same as 1 to 0. The roughness, which is how crisp that reflection is, and the bump, which is the surface quality. We can actually add in more layers here. So if we want to add in sort of an absorption layer, if this is a material that actually is allowing like glass or stuff to move through it, then we want to add that in. And there's some other things here that are more advanced and more technical. We can also add more layers in. So if you wanted to replicate a wood that maybe has a thick coat of polyurethane on top of it, we could do a coating layer, which we can make that layer get the reflectivity and the layer beneath be something separate. And you can actually do multiple layers with different degrees of transparency on top of each other. So if you wanted to have, say, create a material that was a metal base that had maybe paint on top of it that's kind of splotchy in areas, you could replicate that here. That's sort of an advanced material that we're not really going to cover, but just sort of mentioning it. There's also some other tabs here. So if you wanted to make any material into an emitter, so it emits light, you could do that. Clipping, which we'll cover shortly. Displacement. So displacement is similar to what we do in bump. The difference being it creates physical new geometry, whereas a bump map only simulates the shading that would happen if the geometry existed. And I'll show you what I mean by that. In general, I would recommend not using bump map except for, once you know what you're doing and for specific areas of higher levels of detail. It does tend to slow things down. Medium, again, this is really about absorption through the material, so we're just going to ignore that for the time being. So we're going to click the little palette here and go to bitmap. And I'm just going to select the tile diffuse layer. And I'm just going to apply this to my layers, and I know I want this to apply to the base. So I have actually already scaled this to be appropriate, and you can see it's really shiny right now, not realistic to a tile. So I'm going to select the base. Let's see here. Nope. There it is. And again, use the box mapping method. So if we look at that texture, we could decide how big these tiles are. So maybe each tile here is, say, 2 foot by 4 foot. So in that case, we know that this is 2 foot, 4 foot, 6 foot, 8 foot. And then it's 12 feet in the other direction. So it's 4 foot, 8 foot, 12 foot. And that will help us to keep these tiles scaled appropriately to one another, but also be realistic to a scale that we actually want to use in the model. So we want to make sure that it's set to 8 by 12. So when I do my box mapping, I want to pick a starting point because that's where the texture is going to line up. So you can see here that the line of this tile doesn't actually align to this edge. And I currently am, you can see it wants to align to your default axes, and right now my C-plane is a rotated C-plane from the model. But if I hit 3-point, it'll allow me to draw it along any edge. So now I can do, what did I say first? Let's do 8 feet. And just snap to this. And then 12 feet. And hit enter. And then we need to do, so for the height, I'm just going to set it to 8 feet again. Height isn't going to matter as much for this right now. Now you can see here that I actually accidentally did 8 by 8 by 8. So I want to make sure I stretch one of these directions. So let's see which one it was. That looked wrong. And I'm just looking at the visual feedback. Oh, that was actually the wrong one. 8 by 12. Okay, so that stretched it, I think, in the right direction. If I look down on these, I should be able to get a sort of visual of, they look stretched. Maybe it's this one? Nope. I think it was that I shouldn't have assigned them to 2 by 4 or something. But either way, stretch these until, or adjust this until you get the sort of proportions of the tile that you're interested in. It doesn't have to be exactly what it was in the original texture. You can kind of decide this for yourself. So I'm now going to come down and I want to get a view where I can see the reflectivity of this tile. So usually that means I'm going to get something pretty close. We can see it's super reflective right now. So the basics is I could just adjust the roughness, give it a higher rough value. You can see that it's still reflective, but you can't actually see the sort of building as clearly in the image anymore. Now it takes a little while to sort of clean up, so we only get a sort of a preview of what this looks like. Now if we maybe add a low value, such as, so if we go to 0, you can see it's perfectly reflective. We can see the glass frame above. Whereas if we add in just a little bit, it starts to become blurrier, and around 8% or 11% starts to be maybe more realistic tile. However, I'm going to apply a bitmap here because I have a roughness tile where it's going to use basically the values of this image to define a inconsistent roughness. And in this case, I'm just going to turn it more or less all the way up, but maybe a little bit less. So I can now adjust this, but the roughness it's defining is based on an image instead of just being consistent all the way across. So you can already see it gets, the tile has a little bit more variability in it. And the lower I take this value, the more reflective it's going to appear, or the crisper the reflections are going to be. And this becomes somewhat personal preference, but also how reflective do you really think this tile would be in real life? So I'll just leave it there. The next is going to be the bump map, which I'll just go to apply and go to the bump. And in this case, I'm going to give it a low value. So if we look at the ground here, look at the difference in the sort of lines, very flat lines. If I add a bunch of value, you can see here, they start to look like they're three-dimensional. It's not, it's just giving you a two-dimensional shading effect to the surface to make it appear three-dimensional. So if you were to go really high with this, you can see it starts to look kind of crazy. The surface becomes kind of potted. The lines in the texture become really heavy and overly exaggerated. And again, this is just sort of simulating 3D depth. If we actually look down at the edge of this, you can see it's really not actually three-dimensional depth. It's just shading applied to that surface. So I think a low value for the bump goes a long way, just enough so we could start to read the edges a little bit, but not so much that we're over-exaggerating the look of the thing. So now, oops. Sometimes it's easier to see these things in shadows where it's not being overly blinding. But we can see that the tile is looking pretty realistic. And we can see the reflection is being variably manipulated across the surface. So that looks pretty good. Now, roughness, sometimes you'll get an opposite texture called gloss or glossiness, which essentially is just the inversion of this. So we can invert textures too by clicking this button. Sometimes it takes a second to invert. Or you actually might have to stop the rendering to invert it. There it goes. And basically what that's going to do is totally change the look of things. Because basically the whiter the value, the more diffuse the reflection is going to be. The darker the value, the less diffuse that reflection is going to be. So this would mean all of our edges are now going to be really clean, crisp reflections, whereas our surface of the tile would be a really diffused reflection, which is kind of the opposite of what we want. But if you ever get a gloss map as opposed to a roughness map, all you have to do is invert it, and then it will work the same. They are functionally the same thing, just in reverse of each other. And different rendering engines use one or the other. Okay, so that's your basic texture there. Now, I'm going to create one or two others. So now I'm just going to create a simple surface to show the next texture. I'm just going to do a vertical plane. And just pull that up. So I'm going to go back through the same process, go to materials, create a new material, and we'll call this next one screen. And as usual, press the edit button to open it in material editor for Thea. Now in this case, I'm actually going to do, let's do a metal screen. So, and we'll apply it directly to the surface. So because I haven't made a layer for this, I'm just going to apply to objects. And now we're going to go to the clipping tab here. And we want to enable clipping, and then it's going to ask us to put in a bitmap. And I'm going to do the grate one, so I'm going to go to the alpha channel for grate. And you can see here, basically, the texture is now transparent wherever it's black and opaque wherever it's white. So this is a great way to make screen materials that you can see through. Now I'm going to do the same thing of box mapping. Just click one of the points, and let's just set this to, how about 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot. And now you can see it's scaled to be something smaller. Interesting looking. And I'm going to turn Thea back on so we can see it is very metally, very reflective right now. Very weird looking. I'm actually going to, without making any adjustments, I'm just going to turn the roughness up a bit so we can be a little less confused about the reflections. And now I'm going to add a bump map to this. So I have a separate bump map that I've supplied that is this image. It's a grayscale image. And what it'll do is be able to sort of demonstrate, I think, pretty nicely the effect of bump maps. So if we turn the value up on this, we can see, turn up real high, the surface starts to get the appearance, oops, it starts to look three-dimensional. You can see that it looks like it's waving now. And that's because it's using the height information from this black and white image here to simulate the shading that would affect the surface if it were actually three-dimensional. So we could do a light amount if we wanted, just to give it a sort of a light sense. Again, you can kind of see it down here in the shadow areas a little bit more than what's in direct light. But the higher the value, the more that impacts it. So a nice way to sort of simulate sort of a three-dimensional metal screen. We could, of course, this doesn't have to be metal. We could have done basic material, make that into, so we could just do a standard color. So to diffuse, instead of doing bitmap, we could just click here and just do a color. So now it's red or teal or purple. And again, it will take on the same transparency and the same bumpiness and the same roughness as it would if it were metal. This might be maybe a plastic screen of some sort at this point. Okay, so now that you've created a bunch of materials that you are interested in and you're happy with, I'm just going to rotate this guy so I can see it in my camera, because I think my camera is right here. When you are happy and you are ready to actually export, so I'm going to turn off the Thea render and just go to the standard shaded mode. Actually, I'm going to do exports in a separate video because this one's getting pretty long already, but there will be a Thea video for exporting. So look out for that one. All right, thanks.